were created, nor can justly accuse their maker, or their making, or their fate, as if predestination overruled their will, disposed by absolute decree or high foreknowledge. They themselves decreed their own revolt, not I. For I foreknew, foreknowledge had no influence on their fault, which had no less proved certain unforeknown. So without least impulse or shadow of fate, or aught by me immutably foreseen, they trespass, authors to themselves in all, both what they judge and what they choose. Now you'll understand why certain people, like the lecturer Dr. Lawrence, who I told you about in an earlier lecture, began with Republic 10:6-17. The responsibilities with the chooser, God is justified, a line that Milton obviously would agree with as well. God says here, humans, man and woman, choose to fall, and therefore I'm off the hook. For so I formed them, free, and free they must remain till they enthrall themselves. I else must change their nature and revoke the high decree, unchangeable, eternal, which ordained their freedom. They themselves ordained their fall. You can see that Milton's theodicy and his theodicic answer is to repeat several times to make sure that everybody's getting it. In other words, you cannot blame God for the fall of humankind because humans were created free to choose. Now, of course, the counter-argument will be, well, if God had not created humans at all, they wouldn't have to make the choice. So why did God even create at all? It's an interesting question. Milton will obviously have some answers, as we said. The first sort, by their own suggestion, fell. In other words, the angels, Satan himself, self-tempted, self-depraved. However, man falls deceived by the other first. Man, therefore, shall find grace, the other none. In mercy and justice both, through heaven and earth, so shall my glory excel, but mercy first and last shall brightest shine. Ending at line 134. Okay, let's pause for a moment now and take some notes. It's significantly important. This idea has been so influential in the history of thought that we've got to make sure we understand it. Theodicy, very simple for Milton. Whose fault is it? Well, obviously it's not God's fault. We should point out, by the way, that both the great thinkers Erasmus and Luther had already been struggling with this idea. Erasmus in his text on free will, Luther in the famous text, The Bondage of the Will. The idea is, whose fault is it that human beings have sin, pain, evil in the world? And the answer is, it's humans' fault. God created them to be able to choose. And in their choosing, they had the ability. Now, of course, why did God, a perfect being, create in the first place? Well, again, we've got several answers here, starting, of course, with maybe pleasure. God wanted the glory, eternal purpose. There seems to be almost a suggestion, the need maybe for some kind of worship and possibly love. Can you think of any time ever creation happens without some kind of need? Even if it's just that you're bored. Milton will say, there had to be some need here. What was that need? There it is. Now, also, let's point this out as part of his understanding. Knowing something is going to happen is not the same thing as making it happen. Predestination, in other words, is not foreknowledge is not predestination. And for that reason, there is no guilt then for Milton towards God. You can't blame God for the fact that Adam and Eve eat of the forbidden fruit. But wait a minute. God allows Satan into Eden. Couldn't God stop Satan? See, this is the ongoing dilemma for Milton as he tries to justify the ways of God to men, right? Now, why are the angels and Satan, as fallen angels and Satan, why are they given no mercy? Because they chose of their own accord. Humans, on the other hand, here we'll see it with Adam and Eve, by book 9 this will happen, right? They are deceived, the great deceiver Satan. And because they are deceived, then they are allowed to have some possibility of mercy. Okay? The obvious question is, why wouldn't God just stop it? And this is, again, the challenge of how we justify the ways of God to man. And then at 3b, and we'll come back to this question, and here for a moment, you can, just kind of give this some consideration. Does this argument work for you? as letting, quote unquote, letting God off the proverbial hook here, right? Well, we then have the conclusion of the speech, and now the Son. Now notice, we're not talking about Jesus Christ, not yet. And in the speech that runs from lines 144 to 166, we have a series of interesting rhetorical questions that begins with, O Father. Gracious was that word which closed thy sovereign sentence, that man should find grace, for which both heaven and earth shall high extol thy praises with the innumerable sound of hymns and sacred songs, wherewith thy throne encompassed shall resound thee ever blessed. For should man finally be lost, should man thy creature late so loved, notice here the word loved is used, that God loved his creation, thy youngest son fall circumvented thus by fraud, though joined with his own folly. In other words, the Son's question, not Christ yet. The Son's question is, are you really going to allow this to happen? Notice the continuation of some of these rhetorical questions. Shall he fulfill his malice, then thy goodness bring to naught, or proud return though to his heavier doom, yet with revenge accomplished, and to hell draw after him the whole race of mankind, by him corrupted? In other words, are you going to let all of humans go to hell because of this? Or wilt thou thyself abolish thy creation? We immediately, of course, think later in the book of Genesis of the story of Noah and the flood. Wilt thou thyself abolish thy creation, and unmake for him what for thy glory thou hast made? Here, Milton again will say that man was created for God's glory, which does beg the question, if a perfect being has all glory, why would the perfect being need to create for more glory? It's, again, part of the question of the poem, right? So should thy goodness and thy greatness both be questioned and blasphemed without defense. In other words, the Son says, if you allow Satan into Eden, and because you allow Satan into Eden, man and woman make the wrong choice and fall, disobey and fall, well, you're going to get blamed for that. Obviously, Milton is acutely aware of what's going on here with this question. In other words, the Son of God's series of rhetorical questions all lead God now to a second speech starting at line 170. Let's work through these lines here. O Son, in whom my soul hath chief delight, Son of my bosom, Son, who art alone my word, my wisdom, and effectual might. All hast thou spoken as my thoughts are, all as my eternal purpose hath decreed. Man shall not quite be lost, but saved who will. So we'll now begin to hear the second part of Milton's theodicy. Divine justice demands obedience and punishment if disobedience. But mercy, or the potentiality of salvation, will be a central part of Milton's Christian theodicy and theology as well. The core of this idea is simply this: humans must die for their sinning. But then the question is, how can humans be saved? And here we find ourselves with this notion of sacrifice. Now, it's no throwaway that early on in Book 1, Milton will play the game of the terrible Moloch, who will engage in child sacrifice. And then a line later that we already looked at, where the Passover is referenced as God's ability to slay all of the firstborn. Now we're going to continue with this notion of the necessity of sacrifice, and more particularly, the Son of God's sacrifice. Who will, this is the question, who will help to redeem lost humanity? At line 216, the question is finally posed. Where, say heavenly powers, where shall we find such love? Which of ye, talking to all of the angels and to the Son, which of ye will be mortal to redeem man's mortal crime, and just the unjust to save? Dwells in all heaven charity so dear? We're told all of the angels, now quiet. which will be, of course, in direct opposition to the way that we will see them here in a while. After the decision is made that the Son will become the Redeemer, all of heaven will rejoice with music and song. But right here, right now, dead silence across all of heaven. And then the Son's response. In a word, starting at line 2 to 6. Father, thy word is past. Man shall find grace, and grace not find means, that finds her way. The speediest of thy winged messengers to visit all thy creatures, and to all comes unprevented, unimplored, unsought. Happy for man so coming. He, her aid, can never seek, once dead in sins and lost. In other words, atonement for himself, or offering meet, indebted and undone, hath none to bring. In other words, he says, once man is dead, there's nothing he can do. Divine justice will require that he be sent to hell. And then, of course, the famous line at 2:36. Behold me then. Now, of course, this is a mirroring of that famous speech in Paradise Lost Book 2 by Satan, where he says, I will do it, I will do it. And of course, every time he uses the first person pronoun I or me, it's all about narcissism. Notice how in this passage, though, the Son of God will say, behold me, and I will do it. Behold me, me. But notice it's all about not narcissism, but rather obedience to his Father. Behold me then, me for him. Life for life I offer. On me let thine anger fall. Account me, man. I, for his sake, will leave thy bosom, and this glory next to thee freely put off, and for him, lastly, die well pleased. But, a few lines later, I shall rise victorious and subdue my vanquisher. And for those of you who are paying attention here, this is exactly the very lines of Paradise Lost Book 1, when Satan says, I will not be vanquished, I will rise. So notice Milton's playing a very interesting mirrored game here at 2b. We'll come back to make that observation in a bit. My vanquisher, spoil of his vaunted spoil. In other words, I will, if you will, out Satan, and I will beat him at his own game. Death, his death's wounds shall then receive, and stoop inglorious of his mortal sting disarmed. Wow. I, through the ample air in triumph high, shall lead hell captive, maug hell, and show the powers of darkness bound. Thou at the sight pleased out of heaven shall look down and smile. We think of that Psalm 2 verse about God smiling. We don't normally think of God smiling, but the Son says you will smile. While by thee raised, again we're back to the word raised, I ruling all my foes, death last, and with his carcass glut the grave. Then with the multitude of my redeemed shall enter heaven, long absent and return, Father, to see thy face, wherein no cloud of anger shall remain, but peace assured and reconcilement. Wrath shall be no more thenceforth, but in thy presence joy entire. So the Son's response is simple. Send me. I will do it. God's response is what you would predict. At line 280, it starts at line 274, but at line 283 he says, be thyself man among men on earth. At line 298 he says, so heavenly love shall outdo hellish hate. A few lines before that he says, and dying rise, and rising with him rise. So we're back to this resurrection theme. So notice that Milton is playing a very interesting game with us in books 1 and 2 of Paradise Lost, when he has Satan appear to be the protagonist, the hero of his poem. And yet here, for example, we will have the same words being used, but obviously in a much different way, right? Much different way. Finally, at lines 312 to 343, because in thee, God says, love hath abounded more than glory abounds. Therefore, thy humiliation shall exalt with thee, thy manhood also, to this throne. Here thou shalt sit incarnate, here shalt reign both God and man, Son both of God and man, anointed, universal King, all power I give thee, reign forever, and assume thy merits under thee as head supreme. And then the list goes on. The compelling idea here, of course, is that God says to his Son, yes, I will allow this to happen. And of course, after Milton wrote Paradise Lost, he wrote a poem called Paradise Regained that we'll obviously study closely, where the same kind of ideas will be represented. We'll come back to the idea of Paradise Regained in the very final words of this book 3. Well, now let's finish. We have a beautiful song of worship, lines 373 to 415. Some amazing poetry. If I had more time, I would read it all. I challenge you to just read it out loud for yourself to hear the beautiful ideas expressed. I will point out, though, at line 410, just because it's beautiful. For man's offense, O unexampled love, love nowhere to be found less than divine. Hail, Son of God, Savior of men. Thy name shall be the copious matter of my song henceforth, and never shall my harp thy praise forget, nor from thy Father's praise disjoin. The worship song then will be concluded. And at line 416, we then will move out of heaven to Satan. And it's quite compelling, and scholars of this poem have pointed out that right away, as we move, we are going to pay attention to how Milton's language changes. For example, we have not had what we call an epic simile in Book 3 yet. But the minute that we meet Satan, guess what? An epic simile, the language of Satan. Let's continue. Thus they in heaven, above the starry sphere, their happy hours in joy and hymning spent. Meanwhile, upon the firm, opacious globe of this round world, whose first convex divides the luminous inferior orbs enclosed from chaos and the inroad of darkness old, Satan, alighted, walks. Let's pay attention to the word alighted. Of course, it can mean to lighten, brighten, but alighted also means to land, right? In other words, we have Satan now who has arrived. A globe far off it seemed. And we are told that as he is alighting, at line 431 we are told, here walked the fiend at large and spacious field, as when a vulture on Emmaus's bread, whose snowy ridge the roving Tartar bounds, dislodging from a region scarce of prey, and on it goes for a number of lines. So on this windy sea of land the fiend walked up and down, alone, bent on his prey, alone. For other creature in this place, living or lifeless to be found, was none. Satan, then, we are told what it is that he sees. I can't go into this. I wish I had more time. Milton, following some of the things that he says in Areopagitica, as a Protestant theologian and believer, will have some issues with Catholic theology. But what Satan will see, we are told, is any number of things, including the paradise of fools that we are told, which is, some Catholic bashing. In other words, Catholics are seen by Milton as theologically insufficient. I'll let you do your own research on this just because I don't have enough time to get into it. Satan then will discover the angel who is the guard of the new world, Uriel. And now we are to the end of Book 3. Let's finish with our notes now, starting at line 540. Satan, from thence on the lower stair that scaled by steps of gold a heaven gate, looks down with wonder at the sudden view of all this world at once. And then we immediately begin with another simile, as when a scout through dark and desert ways with peril gone all night, at last by break of cheerful dawn, blah, blah, blah. We finish that simile at line 554. Such wonder seized through after heaven seen the spirit malign, but much more envy seized at sight of all this world beheld so fair. He will land at then line 588. And using a reference to Galileo, the idea is that Satan is like a sunspot on the sun as he moves. At line 588, finally, he lands. The fiend, a spot, which perhaps astronomy and the sun's lucent orb through his glazed optic tube, yet never saw Satan as a sunspot. Then, Satan at line 604 as old Prometheus from the sea. We think of Wordsworth's "The world is too much with us" at the very conclusion, right? The mention of Proteus. The idea of Proteus here, of course, is a shape-shifter. In other words, he is a deceiver. He is not what he appears to be at all. Finally, at line 654, we will have Satan speaking to Uriel, and Uriel has no idea what it is that he's talking to. He has no idea that he is in fact speaking with Satan. Satan will say, "Hey, I want to come and worship and pay attention to and be blown away by this amazing creation man. Can you point me in the direction of Eden?" And of course, poor Uriel, he has no idea at all of what's going on. We will continue then at 680. So spake the false dissembler, unperceived. Didn't know. Uriel didn't know. For neither man nor angel can discern hypocrisy. This is an important set of lines. We'll come back to it as we play this game here in a little bit of level 2 and level 3. The only evil that walks invisible except to God alone by his permissible will through heaven and earth, and oft, though wisdom wake, suspicion sleeps at wisdom's gate, and to simplicity resigns her charge, while goodness thinks no ill where no ill seems, which now for once beguiled Uriel, though regent of the sun, and held the sharpest sighted spirit of all in heaven, who